Welcome to the Free Will Show. I'm one of your hosts, Taylor Sear.
And I'm your other host, Matt Plummer. In the previous episode, we discussed the problem of logical fatalism. In this episode, we'll be talking about the threat to free will from divine foreknowledge, which is sometimes called theological fatalism. We'll end with a discussion of why this problem is important, whether or not you believe God exists.
Our guest this episode is Linda Zagzebski. And as always, if you have questions for us that you'd like us to address in our Q&A episode at the end of the season, feel free to get in touch with us through our website, thefreewillshow.com, or through social media at The Free Will Show.
Thanks for listening.
Enjoy. I'm very happy to introduce our guest, Linda Zagzebski. Linda is the George Lynn Cross Research Professor and Kingfisher College Chair of the Philosophy of Religion and Ethics at the University of Oklahoma. She's the author of a book on the topic of today's episode called The Dilemma of Freedom and Foreknowledge, published in 1991 by Oxford University Press. And she has published several books since on issues in the philosophy of religion and ethics, most recently a book called Exemplarist Moral Theory, published in 2017 by Oxford University Press. So thanks so much for joining us, Linda. Can you start by telling us and our listeners a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank both of you for inviting me. And I think this is a really interesting and important series of podcasts that you're doing.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Part of it. Yeah. Now, I have not done much work on free will in general. What has always interested me is the puzzle of how any of us can make choices among alternatives if there's a God who knows the entire future infallibly, meaning in a way that cannot be mistaken. And I was curious about that puzzle even as a child. I thought that God must know everything infallibly because God's perfect. But I also thought that we have control over some part of our lives, the part where we get to choose one thing over another. So I've always hoped that there's a way out of the problem of infallible foreknowledge that preserves both God's perfect foreknowledge and our free will. So I've always thought there's got to be solutions to this dilemma. And so I actually wrote my first book on that issue 30 years ago, the book you mentioned, and have thought about it ever since. But I've also done a lot of work in other areas of philosophy, epistemology, and philosophy of religion, and more recently, ethics. But I still keep going back to it. So that's why I was very pleased to be invited to talk about it today.
Yeah, well,
Awesome.
yeah, we appreciate you coming on with us. So we're talking about theological fatalism, or you could say it's the threat to free will from divine foreknowledge. And in a previous episode, we've talked about fatalism before, but this term is used in all sorts of different ways. Could you explain what you take fatalism to be and what it means to be a theological fatalist?
Yes. What I mean by fatalism is just the theory that all events occur as a matter of fate, meaning it's impossible that they do not occur. Somebody could believe that a particular event is fated, but not all events. And there's interesting stories about that. So they might think, for example, that it's your fate that you will die at a certain time. Your number is up, that idea. Or it could be your fate that you will do some life-altering act, like the fate of Oedipus in Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, where it's fated that he would kill his father and marry his mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I there's more than one way to interpret that play, but you could see it as a story in which no matter what choices Oedipus makes and whatever paths he takes, he's going to end up killing his father and marrying his mother, one way or another. All events, all paths lead to those acts. So that's one kind of fate, where there's a particular fated event that will happen no matter what. And that captures people's imaginations. And as I said, there's lots of stories about it, not just the Oedipus story. But global fatalism is different. And that's when we talk about fatalism, That's usually what people have in mind, where global fatalism is the theory that every event is fated. So nothing can happen except that particular event. Every step you take, every thought you have, every choice you make is fated. It not only will happen, but it must happen. And this is scary.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it seems to take away our control over our lives. Because, if we are not able to act in such a way that we could have done some other act instead, that seems to mean that you don't have free will. I mean, it means if free will is the power to do something else instead, then you don't have free will if everything is fated. So the idea that everything is fated, everything happens out of necessity, is what I mean by fatalism.
Yeah.
That's helpful. And you already said a little bit about this, but the sense of free will that you have in mind, you take free will to involve the ability to do something other than what you actually do. And that's what
Right.
infallible foreknowledge seems to call into question.
That's right. So here's why infallible foreknowledge seems to take away free will. So I'm in Santa Fe right now, and my husband and I plan to go back to Norman in a week or so. But we haven't decided exactly when, and there's no urgency to go back on any particular day or anything like that. We can just go when we decide to. But suppose God knew infallibly a long time ago that I would go back to Norman from Santa Fe on a particular day next week. Let's suppose he knew exactly when we would leave, when we would stop along the way, what route we would take, what I would eat every time I would take a sip of water in the car. Suppose he knew all of that infallibly, meaning he could not be mistaken in what he believed about it. That seems to imply that I cannot do anything else but go back to Norman in exactly the way God foreknew. And that makes it look like I'm not free.
Great. So we're going to ask you to give a more formal presentation of this argument, this challenge to free will from divine foreknowledge. You already mentioned one term that might be helpful to explain before getting into the details, and that's God's infallibility. So what exactly does it mean to say that God is essentially omniscient or infallible?
Yeah, so essentially omniscient means God knows everything because of his nature. That is, he not only knows everything, knows all truths, but knows them necessarily because of God's divine nature. And when we say that, that seems to imply that God can't make a mistake in any belief he has. So it's important, I think, to distinguish between knowing infallibly and just plain ordinary knowing that you and I have.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I know lots of things. I know that my car is in the garage, for example. I know I'm talking to you. We also know lots of things about the future. I know that I'm teaching a seminar on foreknowledge and fatalism starting next week. But our way of knowing is fallible. At least most of what we know is fallible. We can make a mistake. So it's possible that my car is not in the garage. And it's possible that I will not teach the seminar after all next week. But we say we know these things as long as what we believe is true and we have good reason for the belief. So for ordinary knowing, the kind of knowing that you and I have, it's sufficient to say that what we believe is true and we have good reason for it. And that seems to be enough to say we know it. And so in that sense, weaker sense of knowing, you can know lots of things about the future. But infallible knowing is stronger. It's not just believing something true with good reason. It's believing in a way that cannot be wrong, that cannot be mistaken. And that assumption about God's knowledge is important for the argument. It's that It's not only that what God believes is true, but that what God believes cannot be false. It's not possible for it to be false.
Yeah. Another term that I think is important in order to understand this argument has to do with temporal necessity. So, what does it mean to say that something is temporally necessary?
Yes, I've used the term temporally necessary. It's really the same as what people call the necessity of the past.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that everything that happened in the past is now necessary, whether or not it was necessary when it was still future. So the well-known saying, there's no use crying over spilled milk, means that even though you could prevent the milk from spilling before it happens, once it has spilled, there's nothing anybody can do about it. Once an event is in the past, it's beyond our control. So the idea here is that there's a kind of necessity that attaches to time, where events are first contingent, and then after they occur, they become necessary. And so that necessity of the past is very important for the argument about theological fatalism, because we're going to talk about God's past knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's infallibility and the idea of temporal necessity. The last thing maybe we should ask you about before we get into the full argument is what's sometimes called the transfer of necessity principle. Could you give an explanation of that principle?
Yes, it's much easier to explain the transfer of necessity if you can write it up, but it's
Right.
actually fairly simple. It's a logical principle that is actually part of the logics of necessity, of what people call modal logic. And schematically, the principle's this: if some proposition P is necessary, and it's also necessary that if P, then Q is necessary. So here's an example. It's necessary that 5 is a positive integer. It's also necessary that if 5 is a positive integer, then 5 is greater than 0. Therefore, it's necessary that 5 is greater than 0. Now, this principle is, as I said, it's an axiom of every system of modal logic, the logic of necessity. The principle is supposed to tell us in part what necessity means. So this transfer of necessity, if P is necessary, and if it's necessary that if P, then Q is necessary, that seems to be just indisputable when you're talking about logical necessity, the kind of necessity that applies, say, to mathematics, as in the example I gave. But in the argument about foreknowledge, and in other sorts of arguments, like about causal determinism, there's other kinds of necessity that are being discussed. And then people use a transfer of necessity principle. It's not a transfer of logical necessity, but in this case, it's a transfer of the temporal necessity, or the necessity of the past. So the intuitive idea of the transfer of necessity is pretty strong. The question is, does it apply to all forms of necessity? Does it apply to, in particular, does it apply to the necessity of the past? So those are the 3 elements. I mean, you just asked about the God's infallibility, infallible belief, the necessity of the past, and the transfer of necessity principle. And the 3 of those together generate the problem of fatalism.
All right, so we've got all the pieces that we need in order to understand the argument. Can you take us through it step by step?
Yeah, okay, then I'm not going to do it too formally. I'm not going to do
that's fine.
P and Q, but I'm going to try and sort of say it in a slightly more careful way. So first, assume that there is a God who knew infallibly thousands of years ago that I would go to Norman on a certain day. say September 1st, 2020. Now, since the belief is in the past, it has the necessity of the past. I can't make it not have happened. And since God is infallible, I cannot make the belief false. But by the transfer of necessity, if it's now necessary that God had that belief, and necessarily, if God had the belief, then the belief is true, it's now necessary that the belief is true. And that means that my future act has the same necessity that the past has. It's now necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And then looks like I cannot do otherwise than to go to Norman on a certain day. But if I can't do otherwise than to go to Norman on that day, then it looks like I will not go to Norman freely. And similarly, for every act I perform, every act you perform, nothing anybody does seems to happen of their own free will under this assumption that God had infallible foreknowledge in the past.
Great. So that was very helpful. And I will link this in the show notes, but you have a very helpful entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is available online for free on divine foreknowledge and free will. And so if listeners are interested in reading the argument and seeing the more technical formulation, they can always go there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's often pointed out that this is not a new argument. It's an old and venerable argument dating back at least to ancient Roman philosophy. And it's been addressed by many philosophers and theologians, especially in the Christian tradition during the medieval period. What are some of the historically significant responses to the argument for theological fatalism?
Well, there are three major ones that are not only important historically, but all have contemporary supporters. The first is the solution of Boethius. That comes from the 6th century philosopher Boethius. It was also defended by Aquinas in the 13th century. And according to this way out of the problem, God did not know anything in the past because God is not in time. God is timeless, existing in an eternal realm. You have to imagine God in a realm that's just beyond time. So it's not accurate to say God knew anything infallibly in the past, not because God's not infallible, but because God is not in the past. Of course, God's not in the present or the future either. So according to this view, the very first step of the argument is mistaken. So when you begin by saying, imagine God infallibly knew 1,000 years ago that I would go to Norman next week, that's wrong, because God did not know 1,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago or any time at all, because God's outside of time. Now, as I said, this has many adherents. It has certainly historically as well as in contemporary philosophy and theology. If you'd like to know my response to it, I think that what this solution does is to solve one problem only to generate a new one.
Yeah.
So my response is that we don't have any control. Let's imagine God's in the eternal realm outside of time. We don't have any control over the eternal realm any more than we have control over the past. The eternal realm is as much outside our control as the past is. So if there's a necessity of the past, there's also a necessity of eternity.
Mm-hmm.
I have a term for that. That's kind of a term I made up, but it's the same idea that that if God is in eternity and it has infallible knowledge in eternity, and we can't have any control over eternity, then you get an exactly parallel argument starting from the assumption that God has eternal knowledge that is infallible. That has the necessity of eternity, and then by a transfer of necessity principle, everything God eternally knew has that same necessity. So a parallel argument seems to go through. Now, you could say, well, my parallel argument is not as strong or as compelling as the argument about the necessity of the past, because we don't have sayings like there's no use crying over eternal truth. We don't say stuff like that.
Right.
So you could say, and we do say there's no use crying over spilled milk. So we don't have, in our collective imagination, this idea that we can't control 2 + 2 = 4. We don't, we just don't think about stuff like that. But so you might say that the imaginative hold of the argument is weaker, this new argument that I just said. And I mean, that might be right, but my point is that it does not really solve the problem. It doesn't solve the deeper problem that wherever God is, whether it's time or eternity, that seems to be, whether it's the past, whether God's beliefs are in the past or in eternity, either way, it seems like we don't have any control over it, and it has some form of necessity.
Yeah. So it rules out your ability to do otherwise either way.
Yeah, either way, you just shift the argument from a discussion of God's past knowledge to a discussion of God's eternal knowledge. And either way, it seems to be in a realm that we have no control over.
Thanks. That's very helpful. So you mentioned that there were three these historically significant responses that you wanted to talk about. The first was this Boethian solution. What's the second solution?
So the second one is the Alchemist Solution, and that comes from the 13th century English philosopher William of Ockham. And Ockham very cleverly argued that what we call the past is unclear. Events that really occurred in the past are in the real past, or what's sometimes called the hard past. And these events have the necessity of the past. So milk spilled last Tuesday has the necessity of the past. But verbally, we have ways of referring to things in the past or propositions about the past that are veiled references to the future. So think about, suppose I said to you, last month, the first of 4 annual meetings of the Homeowners Association occurred. Now, I could say, okay, last month there was the first of 4 meetings, the other 3 haven't happened yet. Is that proposition about the past, or is it about the future? It seems to be partly about the past and partly about the future. It's partly about the meeting last month and partly about 3 more meetings that haven't occurred yet. And there's lots of propositions like that. Like you could say, this is what generates the problem of logical fatalism. People say, consider the proposition, last month it was true that another meeting would take place 2 months from now. Well, yeah, it's partly about last month, and it's partly about something that hasn't happened yet. So what Occam thought is that you can't tell just by looking at the way a proposition is worded, the fact that it uses past tense in it. You can't tell just by looking at that whether or not it's in the real hard past and therefore has the necessity of the past. Mm-hmm. So the proposition last month, it was true that another meeting would take place 2 months from now, that's not really something in the past. It's partly in the past and partly in the future. Now, the clever part is that Occam claimed that God's past beliefs are like that. They're partly in the past and partly not. So, or partly about the past and partly about the future. So he said that God's past belief that you would do certain acts in the future don't have the necessity of the past, because those beliefs are partly about something that hasn't happened yet. So the whole point of this solution is to call attention to difficulties in distinguishing what happened in the actual legitimate past, an event that actually happened and it's really over and done with, and instead propositions that kind of link past events with future events. And so they're not completely about the past. They're partly past, partly future. And his claim then is to, his idea then is to reject the part of the argument, the premise of the argument that says if God had a belief in the past about my future act, that belief now has the necessity of the past. The idea is no, it doesn't. He thinks it does not.
Yeah.
Now, if you look in contemporary work, many people have been attracted to this solution. Many others say they're not convinced. And so they're, especially in the last, 20 years or so, there's been a lot of debate back and forth about between those who think the argument or the solution works and those who don't. I have not been convinced myself by the Alchemist Solution. I think he's on to something, but it's not, not quite right. Because the problem is intuitively, God's past belief is as much in the past as spilled milk is. If God actually, it looks like a belief that God had in the past is an event that happened and is over and done with. So you can kind of imagine God going over the book of the future in his mind, And so here he is in the past going over the book of the future. He says to himself that I will do all the acts I will ever do, and you will do all the acts you ever will do. And that just seems like, that's as much in the past as anything is. It's like he thought it through and said, yep, that's what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And so it looks, and it just depends on people have different intuitions about this. But God's believing something in the past seems like something that happened in the past, the real honest to God past, and is therefore, as, if spilled milk is necessary, then it looks like that is necessary. So I'm just saying intuitively, I guess I'm not convinced by the solution, but it's extremely clever. And I think that the, it really does show, I think quite rightly, that we don't have a very clear idea of what it means for something to happen and be really over and done with, in the past.
Right. Very interesting. Those first two solutions here, the Boethian and Alchemist solutions, they track parallel responses to the problem of logical fatalism that we talked about in the previous episode. So some of our listeners may have already heard that and might be following along with that. The third solution probably won't have anything in common with a response to logical fatalism. Am I right about that? What's the third solution?
Yes. Yeah, right. So the third solution is the Molina Solution. That's due to the 16th century Spanish Jesuit philosopher Luis de Molina. And this is a solution based on what's called the doctrine of middle knowledge. So the idea of middle knowledge is this: God knows in advance what every free creature would freely choose in every possible circumstance. These are called counterfactuals of freedom. So the idea is God knows for every, just take you as an example, God knows for every possible situation you could ever be in, what you will freely choose to do in that situation. Now, the idea here is that by knowing all of the circumstances that arise from his creation, because God creates the circumstances, then God knows every free choice that will happen in the future. God knows the circumstances. God knows what you would freely do in those circumstances. So then God knows what you're freely going to choose before you do it. So as an example, God knew from the beginning of time that if you and I existed, and if you were interviewing me on this day, and you asked me a certain question, that I would give freely a certain answer. And the same thing applies to every move, every choice any of us make. Now, this solution has received a lot of attention. There was enormous debates about it in the 16th century and big fights over it. between the Dominicans and the Jesuits. And in the 20th century, later 20th century, there were debates about it because there were different sides on this. So the focus is on these so-called counterfactuals of freedom. What are these propositions? What makes them true? So what would make a proposition that says, if Taylor is in this particular circumstance, Taylor would freely choose such and such. That what makes that proposition true? If you say God made it true, then it looks like the game is up, because then it looks like humans aren't free after all. So there's debates about what could ground the truth of the proposition. Did the propositions even make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So there's debates about it, and I'm somewhat neutral on it. I mean, I don't have any particular view about it. But one thing I think that's relevant to what we're talking about right now is notice that the Molina Solution doesn't tell us which premise of the argument for theological fatalism is false.
Right.
It's a story, an account of how God could know the future infallibly without taking away free will. But it doesn't actually say anything about the necessity of the past or the transfer of necessity principle. And of course, it assumes God's infallible, so that it doesn't touch that premise. So my view is that the Molina solution has to be combined with some other solution, something that explains what particular premise of the theological fatalist argument is mistaken. It's a fascinating move, and the fact that people fight over it and have conflicting intuitions means there must be, there's again, just like the Alchemist Solution, I think shows that we're confused about time, what counts as the actual past, and the Molina Solution also shows that there's a lot of things we're confused about, like what makes something true. Do these counterfactuals of freedom make sense? And if so, what would make them true? So that's the third one.
Thanks. That was a great summary of all three of those solutions. You have a view on this, or you've worked out your own solution that's different from these three. Could you talk us through your proposed solution?
Yes. I actually, in my book, I proposed a couple of them. I guess just thinking back on that, if I ever write another book on foreknowledge, I'm not going to have two solutions. People have more than one if they're not confident about it. Yeah, there's something wrong. You think, well, you should never have, like 18 responses to an objection. That's just too many. Yeah. So let me just say what I have thought about in recent years and may write about again. For decades, I have thought that there's something phony about the necessity of the past. And part of what's phony about it is that it's supposed to be a kind of necessity that distinguishes the past from the future. So you imagine time moves along and the future is contingent, and then once the contingent events occur, they become necessary. But prior to their occurring, they're not all necessary. But the argument for fatalism uses the transfer of necessity principle to argue that the future has the same necessity as the past. Everything is, every event, past, present, future, has the same necessity that spilled milk has. But that makes it look like there's something odd about temporal necessity. Like, does it even exist? If it turns out that it isn't a necessity that's distinctive of the past, it turns out that it's supposed to be a necessity that all events have, past, present, and future. So it made me wonder whether, what is this necessity of the past? Do we really think there is such a thing? And what I think now is that I think we confuse the so-called necessity of the past with something that's a metaphysical principle, not a logical principle, but a metaphysical principle that causes must precede their effects. There's no backwards causation. So, in other words, you can um, um, you knock the glass over and that causes the milk to spill. You knock it over first and the milk spills second. You couldn't have the reverse order. Okay, the cause has to come before the effect. Now, here's a question to test what you think about the necessity of the past. Just suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is backwards causation, that's possible. Suppose we have the power to do something that is the cause of something that already happened. Just suppose that. I think that, well, I don't think we have that power, of course, but just suppose we did. If it was possible for a cause to come after the effect, would we say that the past is necessary? Would we say that there's no use crying over spilled milk? I actually doubt it. I mean, you could say, well, I'm just not sure. But that suggests that the necessity of the past might not be necessity that's just about time, but it's about the order of causation, which comes first after effect. And and the principle that a cause must come before its effect, it's not actually necessity. I mean, it isn't clear that actually is a principle that connects with the transfer of necessity principle. Transfer of necessity principle is about necessity, not about causation and the order of it. Now you could say, yeah, there could be, I've written about, are there transfer of causability principles and that kind of thing. And there could be such principles, but I think that it's important to realize that this whole argument takes for granted that we're talking about necessity. And necessity gets a lot of attention from philosophers because we have formal ways of discussing necessity that we call modal logic, where we have axioms and we know what follows from what. And because it has been formalized, we think that we have a hold on what it is. But if we're talking about something that's not literally a necessity of the past, if we're not clear about what that is and if it even exists, then it doesn't help to have these formal principles that might not apply to it. So I guess I would just say in conclusion that I think that the logic of time is full of confusions, and arguments for fatalism draw attention to some of those confusions. They show us how little we really have figured out about time and necessity and the connection between them. And this is something that I think will probably get people's attention for many more centuries. I mean, it's been on the table for, millennia, and it probably will go on for quite some time. I don't think we can expect to solve it anytime soon. But as I said, I might write up something new if I have something more to say about it. And so I will be thinking about this more when I teach my seminar starting next week. This will be the last seminar I teach, the last course before I retire. It's going to be a seminar on foreknowledge and free will. So I'm going to actually go back to the beginning and work on the topic of my first book, and then we'll see what's out of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Something you said made me want to ask. It seems like some people might be tempted to think of the problem of divine foreknowledge and free will as a problem sort of only for theists or people that believe in God. But it seems like thinking about this problem is going to be interesting to anyone who's interested in the logic of necessity and all these related issues about time. So do you think there are any other ways in which thinking about divine foreknowledge can be helpful in other areas?
Yeah, well, let me just first say that I'm very glad you said that because, yeah, people do think often that the problem of divine foreknowledge and human free will is a distinctively theistic or Christian problem. But when you delve into it, you realize that, first of all, I mean, just at the first step, you realize that the puzzle arises not only about God, but about the possibility that anybody, any being at all, could have infallible foreknowledge.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that then leads into questions about why would there be a connection between some property of a knower and necessity? That seems weird. Like what, when somebody knows something, that doesn't seem to have any effect on what's known, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they seem to be two completely different things. Um, and you could talk about knowing in a better and better way, where you aren't wrong and it's almost impossible you will be wrong, and then just make it one step further. It's impossible that you're wrong. Why would that in itself suddenly change what you know and make it something necessary? That's it.
Mm.
It just seems weird that a property of a knower could have that effect on the object that is known. This has nothing to do with God, actually. It's a puzzle about the way we think of the connection between infallibility and time, and how we think of the connection between time and necessity. As I said, these are problems that an atheist should be worried about. There's something that is confused in our thinking that generates this kind of problem.
So thank you so much for discussing this with us. It was a lot of fun. If listeners want to read more of your work on this or other topics, where would you direct them to go?
I think you already mentioned my Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on foreknowledge, which is free and easy for people to find. I have papers that I publish from time to time, but I think I mentioned that I have published most of my work in epistemology and ethics and other areas of philosophy of religion. And so I have a number of books in epistemology, Virtues of the Mind, and Epistemic Authority. And then I have a recent book, Exemplarist Moral Theory, where I proposed my own original moral theory. And so I have a lot of different, I do a lot of different things. I'm not sure that my webpage is up to date. It usually is not, but I do have a webpage on my philosophy department website at University of Oklahoma. I mean, you could find there's ways to find stuff, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at keeping track of people would track me. So
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely link to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article and to your website so that listeners can go there. Well, thanks again, Linda. This was
Yeah.
awesome.
Good.
Thanks for joining us. And thanks, listeners, for tuning in. Our next episode will be about causal determinism. It'll be focused on the consequence argument, and our guest will be Peter Van Inwagen, the John Cardinal O'Hara Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame and Research Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you very much.